Chapter 5 is related to genes and disease, and lesson 5.1 talks about what are genetic disorders. Our objective of this lesson is for you to explain how genetic disorder can occur, describe several common genetic disorders that we're going to cover, identify common genetic tests, and also explain how genetic counseling can help parents to make decisions. So the first topic is inheriting a disorder. What is a genetic disorder by definition? Genetic disorder is a health problem caused by partly or totally by a defect in one or more genes or chromosomes. Because we're not sure which of these genes or chromosomes are going to be damaged, you may or may not be able to see the disability, and sometimes it may or may not even affect a person's ability to function normally. For example, some of these disorders are not so severe in terms of their symptoms. We have male pattern baldness, which may not be a severe disorder because it only happens to male and it only results in a loss of hair. And also, it's not apparent until adulthood. That means when you're first born, no one will know if you have male pattern baldness or not until maybe in your mid to late 20s and you start balding. It does not affect a person's function. So even though it's a type of a disorder, they're not really considered a severe one. Now, it sucks to lose hair for a guy, but it really doesn't affect your normal day-to-day functionality. Unlike male pattern baldness, you'll have other disorders such as cleft palate that you may see the impact of it more closely. Basically, it's a split that starts at a baby's lip and may extend through the soft palate. Usually this forms during early pregnancy, and the cause of it is by genetic or environmental factors. So it's not really one thing that causes cleft palate, but it can be several different things. It can happen in 1 in 700 births, and actually more than 400 disorders include cleft palate as one of their symptoms. This is more apparent and frequent in Asian, Latino, or Native American, and you'll see that different types of cleft palate will happen for boys and girls. For having the cleft lip only, boy to girl ratio is 2-1, so there's more boys with cleft lip only. And unlike the other one, girls are likely to have cleft palate only instead of having both lip and palate split. I have some pictures on the next slide to explain how this cleft palate works. So this picture on the right shows you different variants of cleft palate. So if you only have cleft palate, you won't really see anything out from the outside, but when you open your mouth, you're going to see the soft part of your palate. If you open your mouth, it's going to be the part that's near your throat, and it's going to have a little split in the center or somewhere. And if you have cleft lip and cleft palate, your split is going to start from your lip and then extend all the way through inside your throat. So sometimes you may only have cleft lip and your soft palate may be okay, and sometimes you may have both. Sometimes you may only have cleft palate. Now, because it may be very apparent from birth, when they're crying, you can see it, you can observe it when you have birth. Oftentimes you can fix it by surgeries. It can also cause problems with eating. Obviously, you can't really swallow things properly. An ear infection, because your mouth, nose, and ears all connected, so you can actually have ear infection by not having properly developed mouth parts. You may also have hearing loss for the same reason. You may have hard time forming speech, and you may also have dental problems with your teeth. So actually, it's not just one thing. It affects you in many different areas. So we just took a look at male pattern baldness and cleft palate. So some genetic disorders may never be identified if they don't have any noticeable effects. Or sometimes if you have noticeable effects, it may be later in your life. However, if you have genetic disorders that are apparent, sometimes you may be able to fix it with surgery, sometimes you may not be able to fix it because they're inside of your genes. About 3 in 100 newborns would have some sort of genetic disorders. So we have a number 3 in 100 newborn because we can't observe it. Sometimes the genetic disorder may not be apparent throughout their whole life. The actual number may be higher. So let's go ahead and take a look at some common genetic disorders. And first, before we look into it, we'll have to define the word mutation. So mutation, you have probably heard of it before, means you have some change in just one gene or in a group of genes. So because our DNA is so complex, having one defect in one of the genes can cause some sort of genetic disorders. It's not something like X-Men. Having a mutation doesn't mean you're going to have supernatural powers or you're going to suddenly be able to control the weather or have cool magical things happening to you. It's actually the opposite of it. A lot of times when mutation happen, it is going to affect you in the negative way, and that's why people don't like to have mutations in fruits, animals, or human beings. Now, mutagen is an environmental factor that causes a change in the DNA. So for example, in our day-to-day life, if you're exposed to radiation in a high dosage, or if you're exposed to different types of chemicals, you have a risk of having mutagens exposed to your body and change the components of your DNA. Now, if you're just taking an x-ray or if you're going through airport security, it doesn't mean that you're going to have genetic mutation right away. You'll have to have a higher dosage in order for your cells to be affected. Because radiation goes through your body in a straight motion, sometimes it can go through your DNA. And when they do that, they may alter the sequence of your DNA or maybe destroy some, and that results in mutation. Out of many different genetic disorders, we'll look into a single gene disorder first. So just like the name is indicating, this disorder happens when you have one mutated gene. Now, when we have the single gene disorder, the mutated gene is typically recessive. So we have two different types of genes. We have the dominant one and we have the recessive one. Recessive one is going to be weaker than the dominant, obviously, and it's not going to be apparent unless you have two recessives. So as long as the recessive is with a dominant, the traits are not going to show. But if you have two recessive, like this, you are going to have that mutated trait appearing either physically or mentally. Now you may wonder, traits of D and DD and DR, I don't know what that means, so I'm going to go ahead and explain what these letters mean to you. So this is how dominant and recessive trait works. Not only for mutation, but for any other things that you have a dominant and recessive genes. It could be either your eye color, your hair, if it's either curly or straight. It could be your skin complexion. A lot of things can be determined by this combination. So let's go ahead and take a look. D is going to represent dominant, and R is going to represent the recessive. So let's say your dominant trait is having a curly hair, and your recessive gene is going to be having a straight hair. Let's find out what if your parents are with one dominant and one recessive for both, what is going to be your hair type? Now we talked about how unless you have two recessive, you're not going to see the trait of the recessive. So your parents, let's say this is your father, and let's say the vertical column is for your mother. Now I know that both your mom and dad will have curly hair because even though you have the recessive in there, they are overpowered by the dominant. What you do is from the chart, you're going to start from one column and then you're going to see which of these columns meet up, and it's going to meet up right there. And you're going to have one dominant from your dad and then one dominant from your mom. So what we'll do is we'll just continue doing this. So you're going to start, mom is going to give you D, and dad is going to give you a R. Okay, same thing. You're always going to put the dominant one first, so I'm going to go ahead and work with the dominant here. Dad's dominant, and then mom's recessive. Now, when you come into the last box, you see recessive and recessive. So what you're going to do is you're going to put two recessives together. And when you have two recessive, that means you're going to have the recessive trait. Right? So this is going to be a straight hair. Everything else is going to have a curly hair. So if you have parents with recessive genes, which means they contain genes that are going to have straight hair, you're going to have 25% chance of getting a straight hair. But most likely you're going to have curly hair. The second scenario is having no recessive trait. So let's take a look. Let's say your dad is definitely curly and your mom is curly too, because you don't really have two recessive here. It's one dominant and one recessive. So let's go ahead and fill in the blanks. So even though one of your parents would have the curly hair with a recessive trait, none of the offsprings are going to have curly hair because they're all dominated by dominant trait. Let's say when one of your parents, your dad, would have a curly hair and then also have the recessive trait, and then your mom would have a straight hair. When you fill in the blanks, you're going to see two DRs, which means you're going to have the dominant trait showing, but will have recessive trait inside of your genes, and then you'll have two recessive. That means you're going to have 50-50 chance of either having straight hair or curly hair. The same rule applies for any other genetic disorders. So if your parents are with a recessive trait, it may not be apparent to your parents, but for the offsprings, for your generation, depending on how the genetic components meet up, you may have the disorder. One of the single gene disorders that we're going to look into today is going to be sickle cell anemia. So let's take a look at the picture. We have a hint over here. We have a normal red blood cell, which kind of looks like jam-filled donuts or a cushion. And we also have sickle-shaped red blood cells right here. Kind of looks like a tongue. This is a genetic disorder where the red blood cells, or shortened RBC, form a crescent moon shape or sickle shape. A sickle is actually a tool for farm that kind of looks like this, and that can cut different crops and things like that. So that's why it's called sickle cell. The cell looks like the sickle shape. Now, it's important to have normal red blood cells because red blood cells carry hemoglobin, which is basically an oxygen-carrying protein. If you don't have that protein, your red blood cells can't carry oxygen. And if you don't have oxygen in your body, guess what? You're not going to survive. Now, unlike the normal red blood cells, as you can see, sickle-shaped red blood cells are not going to be as stable, and they're going to actually be more sticky. So what they do is they clump up together and they may block different blood vessels, and that can be very dangerous. So like I mentioned, They can block the blood flow because they can clump up on the sides, smaller blood vessels, and they can also die quicker than the healthy red blood cells. So their lifespan is going to be shorter. That means if you don't have enough red blood cells because they all die off, you'll have to work harder to create those red blood cells. And because of the shortage of the red blood cells to carry oxygen, you may actually have anemia caused by this condition. Not only causing anemia, it can also cause severe joint pains and kidney problems because when they are clumping the blood vessels, you may not have enough oxygen and your joints may also have that effect from those small blood vessels. If you only have one recessive gene, which means instead of RR, you have DR format, you're going to have a milder form of disease called sickle cell trait. When you have sickle cell trait, you're not going to have apparent problems as much, but you have a possibility of passing those genes down to your next generation. And if your spouse would have the same trait for sickle cell, your child will have a higher percentage or probability of getting sickle cell disease. This disease is actually most common to African American. So certain types of diseases are more prone to certain ethnic group, and sometimes ethnic group may not matter as much. So here's a picture of the red blood cells in the regular person, and for the sickle cell anemia patient, you have the picture for the right. So as you can see, for the normal regular red blood cells, they are all round. And for the sickle cell patient, you're going to see a lot of these sickled shape that's floating around, and that may cause different problems.